Welcome to Session 8 of The Lord and the Rings, a biblical study using the works of J.R.R. Tolkien to explore Christian ideas. This week is a little bit of an odd week for me because I initially planned on having both an in-person and online version of this lesson. But unfortunately, sickness has struck my household. My wife and I are both feeling a little bit under the weather, and so I've canceled the in-person session, and this week is online only. So if my voice sounds even worse than usual, it's probably because I have a little bit of a scratchy throat and some congestion. I don't have the most elegant voice at the best of times, and so this sickness makes it a little bit worse, and so I'm sorry. I hope that it won't be too painful to listen to. But if you decide to stick around and actually listen to the lesson, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you putting up with my sickly voice. And so today, I want to explore a particular theme, and I want to start not with the Lord of the Rings proper, but instead with one of the legends that takes place way back thousands of years before the Lord of the Rings began. And this legend actually connects pretty strongly to the Rings of Power show on Amazon. And so I want to look at one elf in particular, and this elf is the brother of Galadriel. And just as a reminder, Galadriel was the elf who, in the Lord of the Rings film, was portrayed by Cate Blanchett, and in the Rings of Power show, there's a younger version of Galadriel portrayed by Morfydd Clark. And in the first season of the Rings of Power show, Galadriel is going around searching for Sauron because she wants to get revenge on Sauron for killing her brother. But the show doesn't really go into a lot of details about what happened to her brother, what happened whenever he and Sauron encountered each other. And so that's actually the story that I want to start out with. I want to start out with the story of Galadriel's brother. So Galadriel's brother was named Finrod, and Finrod was an elvish leader way back in Middle-earth's history, whenever the elves were fighting a war against Morgoth, the evil spirit who had rebelled against God and who was currently trying to conquer the world. And so the elves were fighting Morgoth, and Finrod, seeing that his people might one day be in danger from Morgoth, decided to make a mighty city, a mighty fortress where his people could live and hopefully be safe, be protected. And he looked around the world and he found that the dwarves built their cities in mountains, and Finrod decided that he too was going to build an underground city, an underground fortress to protect his people. And so he employed some dwarves to help him with this undertaking, to help him build this fortress. And the dwarves gave him a name. They called him Felagund, which means cave carver. And so Finrod became known as Finrod Felagund. And his fortress, his city that he had made, was known as Nargothrond. And for a while his people lived in Nargothrond, and they were safe. But the war with Morgoth raged on, and at some point Finrod found himself in the middle of a battle against Morgoth's forces, and things did not look good for Finrod. He was cut off from his people and surrounded, and it looked like he was going to die. But then he was rescued by a man, a human, named Barahir. There King Finrod Felagund, hastening from the south, was cut off from his people and surrounded with small company in the fen of Sarek, and he would have been slain or taken, but Barahir came up with the bravest of his men and rescued him, and made a wall of spears about him, and they cut their way out of the battle with great loss. Thus Felagund escaped, and returned to his deep fortress of Nargothrond, but he swore an oath of abiding friendship and aid in every need to Barahir and all his kin, and in token of his vow he gave to Barahir his ring. It looked hopeless to Finrod. He was surrounded, but Barahir and his men came and they rescued him. And as a result of the rescue, Finrod swears an oath to Barahir, saying, "Hey, I'm going to help you and your family any way that I can. Like, I'm going to have friendship and I'm going to help you however I am able to." And he gave Barahir his ring in sign of this friendship, in sign of this oath. And this ring, it wasn't a magical ring. It wasn't like the rings of power. It didn't have any magical abilities, but it was a token of friendship. It was a sign of Finrod's favor on Barahir and his family. And this isn't super important to the lesson, but just as a side note, the ring eventually passed down to Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. And if you watch the Lord of the Rings films, you can see in several shots him wearing the ring that Finrod gave to Barahir. And in the extended edition of The Two Towers, they actually draw attention to the ring. So time passes, and eventually Finrod's story collides with another legend that we've talked about a little bit in this group, the story of Beren and Luthien. And so I've talked about the story of Beren and Luthien quite a bit in one of the previous sessions, so I don't want to repeat everything. I think that would be extremely boring for you. But as a little bit of a refresher, the important details are this. Many years ago, Morgoth, the evil spirit, had stolen the Silmarils, 3 holy gems that were sacred to the elves. And Morgoth took these gems and placed them into his crown. Then many years later, the human man, Beren, was tasked with stealing at least one of the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. And this quest was given to Beren, but nobody really expected him to succeed. It was a suicide mission. It was given with the expectation that Beren would either abandon the quest or that he would die trying to get the Silmaril. But Beren accepts the quest, and he leaves his love, Luthien, behind because he doesn't want to take her into danger. And he goes off and he tries to figure out how to steal the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. Now Beren was the son of Barahir. He was the son of the man who rescued Finrod. And Barahir at this point was dead. But Beren had that ring, the ring that Finrod had given to Barahir in token of friendship and abiding aid. So Beren goes to Finrod, and he shows him the ring to prove that he really is the son of Barahir, the son of the man that Finrod had promised to aid. And Beren asks for help. And Finrod decides, yes, I am going to help you. This quest is impossible. I don't see how it could possibly end well. But I swore an oath to your father, and I'm going to keep that oath. So Finrod joins Beren on the quest, and other elves who love Finrod and are loyal to him join in on the quest. And so they start trying to figure out how to steal the Silmaril from Morgoth. But while they're on the quest, eventually their group is captured, and they are brought to a fortress that is currently being run by Morgoth's second in command, an evil spirit named Sauron. And Sauron controls this fortress, and he has an army of orcs and the evil creatures that we're used to seeing in The Lord of the Rings. But he also has a couple of creatures that we don't see in The Lord of the Rings proper. the fortress that he controls is famous for having a small army of werewolves guarding it. And Tolkien doesn't go into great detail about what these werewolves look like, but I imagine that they are not the hunky kind. I imagine, based on what we're going to see, that they are more of the rip you limb from limb type of werewolves. But Finrod and Beren and their group are captured and brought to this fortress, and they are brought before Sauron. And Sauron decides that he wants to torture them, to get information out of them, to try to figure out what they were trying to do. But none of them are willing to give up any information. None of them are willing to tell Sauron what they are up to. Sauron cast them, therefore, into a deep pit, dark and silent, and threatened to slay them cruelly, unless one would betray the truth to him. So Sauron throws them into his dungeons, and he threatens them. He performs some psychological warfare against them, saying, okay, if you won't tell me, I'm going to start killing you one by one until somebody gives me the information that I want. So it's a form of torture, of psychological manipulation. From time to time, they saw two eyes kindled in the dark, and a werewolf devoured one of the companions, but none betrayed their lord. So even though they are being slowly killed off, nobody is willing to give Sauron the information that he seeks. And so while they are imprisoned, while they are being killed and tortured, Luthien escapes from her father's control. She comes after Beren to try to help him. She finds out that he has been captured, and she starts to mount a rescue. But in the meantime, Finrod and Beren are still in Sauron's prison. In the pits of Sauron, Beren and Felagund lay, and all their companions were now dead. But Sauron purposed to keep Felagund to the last, for he perceived that he was an elf of great might and wisdom, and he deemed that in him lay the secret of their errand. So Sauron has decided, hey, Finrod Felagund, he seems to be the most important member of this group. He seems to be a mighty elf. I'm not going to kill him. He probably has a lot of valuable information for me, information that I want, and so I don't want to kill him. He might make a valuable hostage, so I'm going to keep him alive, at least, even if I have to kill all the others. But when the wolf came for Beren, Felagund put forth all his power, and he burst his bonds, and he wrestled with the werewolf and slew it with his hands and teeth. Yet he himself was wounded to the death. Thus King Finrod Felagund redeemed his oath, but Beren mourned beside him in despair. So the wolf was coming for Beren. It was coming for Beren, not Finrod. But Finrod escapes from his bonds. He's able to break the ropes or the chains that are holding him. And even though his life isn't in danger at the moment, he attacks the werewolf. He fights with it and he kills it. And he saves Beren, but he gives up his own life as a result. Finrod dies, saving Beren. But because Finrod saved Beren, he bought just enough time for Luthien to mount her rescue, for Luthien to save Beren, and to bring him out of the dungeons of Sauron. And so if you listen to one of the previous sessions, this is the part where Beren decides again that he's going to go off alone and leave Luthien behind, and Luthien has to be like, no, are you an idiot? I had to rescue you. Like, You're just going to get yourself into more trouble if you go off on your own. Let me help you. This is not just your quest, it is our quest. And so Beren and Luthien are able to go on. Beren and Luthien are able to, beyond hope, steal one of the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. But they wouldn't have been able to do that without the sacrifice of Finrod Felagund, without him giving up his own life to protect Beren and buying Luthien the time she needed to mount her rescue. It was only due to his sacrifice that Beren and Luthien were able to complete their quest. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the idea of sacrifice. And going back to the Rings of Power show, in the prologue they talk about how Sauron killed Galadriel's brother, how Sauron killed Finrod. And they don't go into all the details that I have gone into. And that's probably because they didn't want to spend 15 minutes going over what I just went over. And also because they don't technically have the rights to the story of Beren and Luthien. But one thing that I kind of appreciated from the design of Rings of Power is this moment whenever Galadriel is looking over Finrod's body. And if you look at the wounds on Finrod, to me, they don't look like sword wounds or stab wounds or anything like that. If you look at his bicep and at his forearm, those look like claw marks to me. And so it seems like even though they don't go into details about how he died other than that Sauron was responsible, it seems like in the Rings of Power show, through this little detail, they're hinting that it happened the way that Tolkien wrote it, that it was a werewolf that Finrod fought and that killed him in the dungeons of Sauron. So now I want to look at another sacrifice that took place in the ancient days of Middle-earth. And this sacrifice took place during an event called the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And as the name suggests, this is not a happy, joyful story. This is a sad story. And this takes place after Beren and Luthien were able to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. The elves see that Beren and Luthien succeeded, and they start thinking, hey, they were able to break into Morgoth's fortress. Maybe Morgoth isn't as strong as we thought. Let's get all of our forces together, all of our allies, and let's assail Morgoth's fortress. Let's attack him and try to break him, destroy his strength forever. And again, as the name implies, things don't go the way that the elves would have wished. This battle, this great assault, became known as the Nerneath Arnoediad, which in English means the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And by the way, if you ever get a chance to hear Christopher Lee, the actor who portrayed Saruman in Lord of the Rings, if you ever get a chance to hear him say Nerneath Arnoediad, do it. He's done it in an audiobook, and it's amazing hearing that deep, majestic voice say it. It's far better than me saying it. But in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, all the elves and all of their armies gathered to fight against Morgoth. And so there are a lot of characters who are involved in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. But for this lesson, I want to focus on 3. The first is Turgon, the elvish king of Gondolin. And Gondolin was an ancient elvish kingdom. And we've talked about Turgon before, about how he received a message that his kingdom was in danger and he needed to lead his people away to safety, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon his kingdom, what he had built. He couldn't bring himself to stop trusting in his mighty walls and his mighty fortress. But this story takes place before that. And so Turgon had been living with his people in a hidden valley. But he decides to bring his people forth for this giant battle. He leads his people out of his city to join with the elves in their assault. And the other two characters are the brothers Hurin and Huor. And they are human leaders of their people, and they are allies with the elves. And during the Nerneath Arnoediad, they fight alongside Turgon. And so the battle starts, and it lasts for days and days. And things start going poorly for the elves. Some of their allies betray them. Morgoth's forces are stronger than they expected. And things start going badly. And Turgon and Hurin and Huor, they all start seeing that there's no chance that they're going to win this battle. That this has been a disaster. The field was lost, but still Hurin and Huor and the remnant of their people stood firm with Turgon of Gondolin, and the hosts of Morgoth could not yet win the pass of Sirion. Then Hurin spoke to Turgon, saying, "Go now, Lord, while time is, for in you lives the last hope of the elves, and while Gondolin stands, Morgoth shall still know fear in his heart." So Hurin says, "Hey, Turgon, you've got to get out of here. If at least you and your people escape, then there might still be hope. We're going to lose this battle, but maybe if you escape, there will still be a chance that we could win the war." But Turgon answered, "Not long now can Gondolin be hidden, and being discovered, it must fall." I find this a really interesting response by Turgon, especially knowing that whenever the time comes, whenever Gondolin is discovered and he needs to abandon his city, he can't bring himself to do it. Then Huor spoke and said, "Yet if it stands but a little while, then out of your house shall come the hope of elves and men." Put a little pin in that. Remember that. I'm going to come back to it. So it was that Turgon fought his way southward, until coming behind the guard of Hurin and Huor, he passed down the river and escaped, and he vanished into the mountains and was hidden from the eyes of Morgoth. But the brothers drew the remnant of the men of their house about them, and foot by foot they withdrew, until they came behind the fen of Sarek, and had the stream of Rivel before them. There they stood, and gave way no more. So Turgon takes his people and retreats, and Hurin and Huor gather what remains of their people, and they're going to cover the retreat of Turgon. They are going to stand between Turgon and the armies of Morgoth. They are going to continue to fight Morgoth's forces in order to buy Turgon enough time to escape. Then all the hosts of Morgoth swarmed against them, and they bridged the stream with their dead, and encircled the remnant of the men as a gathering tide about a rock. There, as the sun westered on the 6th day, and the shadow of the mountains grew dark, Huor fell pierced with a venomed arrow in his eye, and all the valiant men were slain about him in a heap, and the orcs hewed their heads and piled them as a mount of gold in the sunset. Last of all, Hurin stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield, and wielded an axe two-handed, and it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard until it withered, and each time that he slew, Hurin cried, "Are into Luva, day shall come again." 70 times he uttered that cry, but they took him at last alive by the command of Morgoth, for the orcs grappled him with their hands, which clung to him still though he hewed off their arms, and ever their numbers were renewed, until at last he fell buried beneath them. Huron makes a valiant last stand, but he's facing overwhelming foes, and he knew that he had no chance of defeating them, but he still fought to provide Turgon with enough time to escape. Huron was captured and taken before Morgoth, and Huron didn't have a great time ahead of him. He sacrificed himself, his freedom, to save Turgon. Huron's brother, sacrificed his life to save Turgon. And because of their sacrifice, Turgon survived. And his kingdom, Gondolin, survived a little bit longer. So now I want to talk about the ultimate result of these two seemingly unrelated sacrifices. So we know, I've talked about how Gondolin is eventually discovered and Turgon can't bring himself to abandon his kingdom. And so Gondolin falls eventually, and Turgon eventually dies. But because of the time that Huron and Huor's sacrifice bought Turgon, because they protected him, sacrificing their own lives for him, Gondolin stood for a little bit longer. And it stood long enough for a child to be born in Gondolin and for an escape route to be built out of Gondolin. And when Gondolin was attacked, this child and his parents were able to escape from the fall of the city. And this child was named Eärendil. And Eärendil would go on, as Huor predicted, to be the hope of elves and men. Beren and Luthien were able to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. And eventually the Silmaril passed to their granddaughter, who was named Elwing. And Elwing and Eärendil are living as refugees, and they marry. They become husband and wife. And Eärendil tries to sail westward to get allies, to get aid, to get help for the elves and for men. And whenever he first tries, he is unsuccessful. There's a chain of islands that are heavy with enchantment and magic that are blocking his path and preventing him from being able to go get help. But then his wife Elwing joins him, and she brings the Silmaril with her. And the Silmaril's magic, its holy light, is able to overcome the enchantments of the islands and allow Eärendil to go into the west to intercede on behalf of elves and men and bring aid to them. Aid that ultimately overcomes Morgoth. When writing this small group, I didn't expect to refer to the story of Eärendil as often as I have. But it really is the linchpin of the First Age, the linchpin of the ancient stories of Middle-earth. And as the linchpin, it really contains so many of the ideas and themes that Tolkien works with throughout his writings. It is in this story that the exile of the elves is ended, or at least the possibility of the end of exile is presented. It's in this that eucatastrophe, that hope beyond hope, comes and rescues elves and men and dwarves from Morgoth. It's in this that fellowship and companionship, teamwork between Eärendil and Elwing and his crew comes to fruition. But none of this would have been possible without sacrifices of people generations earlier. Without Finrod's sacrifice, the Silmaril would have never been stolen from Morgoth. Without the sacrifice of Huron and Huor, it's unlikely that Eärendil would have either been born or would have been able to escape Gondolin's fall. These sacrifices permitted the salvation of the elves of Middle-earth from Morgoth. And the idea of sacrifice is carried forward into the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is filled with sacrifices. And perhaps the most famous sacrifice is Gandalf's fight with the Balrog. And I'm not even going to try to do an Ian McKellen impression. He does such an amazing job with the lines. But Gandalf stands and fights against the Balrog in order to protect the Fellowship. At that moment Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained, poised, quivering like a tongue of rock thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools!" he cried, and was gone. Gandalf sacrificed himself for the Fellowship. And I mentioned before how the Fellowship stops in Lothlorien, and they try to heal from their physical wounds and their weariness, and they mourn Gandalf. And whenever describing the fall of Gandalf to Galadriel, Frodo says, "Yet our grief is great, and our loss cannot be mended," said Frodo. "Gandalf was our guide, and he led us through Moria, and when our escape seemed beyond hope, he saved us, and he fell. He saved us, and he fell." Gandalf sacrificed himself. And I love that this isn't in the slides, but Frodo writes a poem, a song in remembrance of Gandalf. And the final stanza that Frodo writes, or at least that we are told that Frodo writes, says, "He stood upon the bridge alone, and fire and shadow both defied. His staff was broken on the stone. In Khazad-dûm his wisdom died." And I love the word choice. I love fire and shadow both defied. I love the use of the word defied to describe Gandalf's actions. He didn't just challenge, he didn't just fight, he defied evil. But Gandalf sacrificed himself to save the Fellowship, to save their quest, to save the world. And yes, we know that Gandalf comes back, that he has a miraculous return. But there's no evidence that Gandalf knew that that was going to happen whenever he sacrificed himself. There was no evidence that he expected to come back. It was still a sacrifice. And it's very easy for us to see parallels between Gandalf and Jesus Christ in this moment, in his death and return. Now, I have to be honest, I don't think that Tolkien would like us to say that Gandalf is Jesus in the same way that, like, Aslan is Jesus in the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien wouldn't have liked that. There's not one character who is or represents Jesus Christ. Like, Gandalf dies and comes back, but Aragorn is the king who returns. But Frodo is the one who takes on the ring, the burden of the world on himself. There's not just one character who is supposed to be Christ, but there are many characters who show Christ-like attitudes, who show reflections of Christ throughout the Lord of the Rings. And Gandalf does so through this sacrifice. Another character who sacrifices themselves, Boromir. And I don't want to talk too much about Boromir because I'm going to bring him up quite a bit next week. But Boromir made a mistake. He tried to take the ring from Frodo. He had good intentions. He wanted to protect his city and his kingdom from falling to Sauron. And the ring used his good intentions against him. It offered him the power that he needed to achieve his goals, his legitimately good goals, but the ring offered it to him, and he couldn't resist. But he realizes his mistake, and rather than die as the broken man who had given in to temptation, he fights to protect his friends, to protect Merry and Pippin. And he dies not as that weak man who has given in to temptation. He dies as a valiant hero who sacrificed himself trying to protect his friends. And both Aragorn and Gandalf acknowledge that by sacrificing himself, that in the end he died a heroic death and redeemed himself from his mistake. Then there is the sacrifice of King Theoden of Rohan, who leads his people to Gondor, to the battle of the Pelennor Fields, to fight against Sauron's forces. And King Theoden dies in the battle. He is killed by the Witch King of Angmar, the leader of the Nazgul. But his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Because of his actions, Gondor and the rest of the world was able to be saved. And as he dies, he speaks his final words, and he tells Merry the Hobbit that his death was worthwhile, that the actions that he did, that his sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Theoden opened his eyes, and they were clear, and he spoke in a quiet voice though labored. Farewell, Master Hobbitla. Hobbitla is the name that the people of Rohan use for hobbits. My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company I shall not now be ashamed. A grim morn, and a glad day, and a golden sunset. Theoden sacrificed himself, but he's not regretful of that sacrifice. He sees it as worthwhile because instead of sitting back and letting bad things happen, he came to the rescue of the people of Gondor. He came to the rescue of really the whole world. And so he doesn't see that as something to be regretted. He sees that his sacrifice had meaning. And when Theoden is buried, whenever they hold his funeral, the following poem is recited describing his death. Out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising, he rode singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. Hope he rekindled, and in hope ended, over death, over dread, over doom lifted, out of loss, out of life, unto long glory. The people of Rohan are sad that they have lost their king, but they don't see his end as something regretful. They see it as something that brought hope. They see that in his death he was able to overcome dread, overcome doom, and do something meaningful for the world. And it's not just Theoden who is mourned. There are thousands of people who had to sacrifice themselves during the war against Sauron. Some of the people, we know their names. We know the names of Gandalf and Boromir and Theoden, but there are many others the average soldier, the average man who don't get named. But their sacrifices aren't forgotten. They are still acknowledged. In a poem that I haven't included in the slides, the dead who sacrifice themselves for the world are honored and praised for standing against evil. In John 15, Jesus says, "As the Father loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands, and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Ephesians 5:1 and 2. Therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Jesus says that there is no greater love than laying down one's life for his friends. And Jesus didn't just say things. He didn't just say to love. He didn't just say giving up your life for others is the greatest form of love. He didn't just say those things. He acted upon those. He showed us love by sacrificing himself, by sacrificing his life so that we could have eternal life. And we are told to be imitators of God, that we are supposed to walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. We are, on some level, supposed to sacrifice for God and for others. The topic of sacrifice is one that sometimes I'm not sure exactly how to talk about it. Because I don't think that every person is supposed to go out and be crucified, or go out and, I don't know, fight a giant fiery shadow demon on a bridge while trying to destroy a ring. Like, I don't think that that is what God has planned for everyone. But God does say that there is no greater love than to lay down one's life, and that we are supposed to be imitators of God, imitators of Christ who loved us and gave himself up for us. And sometimes I have trouble talking about that because I think that mental health is something very important. I think that your mental health and your state of mind have a profound effect on your relationship to God and your relationship to others and your ability to show the love of God to the world. And so I don't think that you're supposed to just go out and, I don't know, run yourself ragged, sacrifice so much and so often that you lose sight of your relationship with God and your relationship with others and your own well-being. But sacrifice is something that we are commanded to do out of love for God and love for others. Going back to the Lord of the Rings, not all sacrifices end in death. Whenever Gandalf and Aragorn and their friends and the Lords of Gondor meet to decide what to do now that the battle is over, their talk turns to Frodo and the ring. They know that Frodo has to get to Mount Doom, that he has to destroy the ring. But the armies of Sauron fill Mordor. How can one little hobbit with his faithful companion Sam, how can they ever hope to get through Mordor while the armies of Sauron fill the land. And Gandalf proposes a solution. Sauron's doubt will be growing, even as we speak here. His eye is now straining toward us, blind almost to all else that is moving. So we must keep it. Therein lies all our hope. This, then, is my counsel. We have not the ring. In wisdom or great folly it has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us. Without it we cannot by force defeat his force. But we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it be. As Aragorn has begun, so we must go on. We must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength, so that he shall empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait. Though his jaws should close on us, he will take that bait, in hope and in greed, for he will think that in such rashness he sees the pride of the new ring lord. Gandalf says, we don't have any hope of beating Sauron through force, through strength. His armies are stronger. He is stronger. But we can still provide Frodo with a chance to destroy the ring if we march our armies out and attack Sauron. Sauron at this point has lost track of the ring. He kind of knew where it was at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, but then a lot of things happened that have kind of confused him. He knows that Saruman's forces captured some hobbits. He doesn't know that they captured the wrong hobbits, Merry and Pippin, but he knows that that happened. But then Saruman fell, and his allies were defeated in Rohan, and his armies were defeated whenever they attacked Gondor. And so now Sauron kind of expects the ring to be in Gondor. And Gandalf says, if we go out, Sauron is going to think, why are they coming out to fight me? They must know that their forces can't defeat my armies. They must have something up their sleeve. One of them must have the ring, and they must be thinking that they can use the ring against me, to overthrow me, to defeat me. And so if we march out, Sauron's going to expect that one of us has the ring, and all of his attention is going to be on us. We must walk open-eyed into that trap, with courage, but small hope for ourselves. For, my lords, it may well prove that we ourselves shall perish utterly in a black battle far from the living lands, so that even if Barad-dûr, the fortress of Sauron, be thrown down, we shall not live to see a new age. But this, I deem, is our duty. They are going to go out and sacrifice themselves. They are going to go out to a hopeless battle to try to give Frodo a chance to save the world. They are going to sacrifice themselves for the future, for everyone else. And they are going to do so willingly. And one of the lords of Gondor, who is a side character who I really like but got cut from the movies, but he has to laugh at the situation, like laugh at the hopelessness of it, like gallows humor. And he says, "Surely," he cried, "this is the greatest jest in all the history of Gondor, that we should ride with 7,000, scarce as many as the vanguard of its army in the days of its power, to assail the mountains and the impenetrable gate of the Black Land. So might a child threaten a mail-clad knight with a bow of string and green willow." He has to laugh at the ridiculousness of it. Like, he's saying, we're so outmatched, we're like a child with a toy threatening a knight in armor. But this lord, even though he has to laugh at the ridiculousness of it, he still goes along with it. He still joins them and is willing to sacrifice himself. Aragorn, Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, the knights of Rohan and Gondor. They are going out to what they believe is their death, but they are willing to sacrifice themselves for the rest of the world. And of course, most of them don't die because Frodo does destroy the ring. And the death of Sauron and the fall of his tower causes chaos and confusion among the enemies of Aragorn and Gandalf and their friends. And so most of them survive. But they didn't expect that whenever they marched out to meet Sauron's forces. And of course, I can't talk about sacrifice without talking about the hobbits, and particularly Frodo and Sam. Frodo, in a lot of ways, I think, had the worst of it. He was carrying the ring. The ring was messing with his mind and with his emotions. But Sam, loyal, faithful Sam, he wasn't having a great time either. Like, yes, he got to see some amazing sights that no hobbit had seen before. But he also had to go through great difficulty. He had to go through periods of pain and of want. And we've gone over in past lessons their struggle through Mordor and how even Sam lost hope at one point. And so first, I want to focus on Sam, because he did give up his life of peace and of comfort to come along with Frodo. He would have been happier, had a better time if he had stayed in the Shire. But he knew that he was needed, that there was something he had to do before the end. And so he sacrificed his happy, comfortable life to go with Frodo on the journey. And at one point, Tolkien considered having Sam sacrifice even more than he already had. What I'm about to show is from a little outline that Tolkien did whenever he was trying to plan out events for The Lord of the Rings. And what I'm about to show is kind of written in fragments because it was kind of just notes and ideas that he was writing for himself. But this section shows some of the ideas that Tolkien had for how the story would end. Frodo and Sam have made it to Mordor. They have made it to Mount Doom. But Frodo can't destroy the ring. At that moment, Gollum comes up and wrestles with him and takes ring. Frodo falls flat. Here perhaps Sam comes up, fights off a Nazgul's fell beast, and hurls himself and Gollum into the gulf. Function for Sam? Is he to die? He said there is something I have to do before the end. Tolkien briefly considered having Sam sacrifice himself to destroy the ring and save Frodo and the rest of the world. And it doesn't seem like this idea lasted very long in Tolkien's mind. And as somebody who loves Sam, I'm glad that Sam got a happier ending than this. I'm glad that he was able to go back to the Shire to start a family and to find peace. But if you were going to kill Sam off, I can't think of a more fitting way to Sam, who just really embodies the idea of sacrificing yourself and your own happiness for your friends and for the world around you, than for him to throw himself with the ring into Mount Doom to save Frodo and the world. Again, I'm glad that that isn't how Sam's story ended, but it really kind of gets to the heart of Sam's character and just how willing he is to sacrifice himself for others. And then there is Frodo. I feel bad because sometimes I think that by talking so much about Sam, I kind of discount Frodo, and I don't want to do that because he carried so much of the burden. It was him that the ring was messing with most of all. It was him who the ring was getting inside of his head. And so this passage that I'm about to read comes from the Fellowship of the Ring, whenever Gandalf is describing to Frodo the history of the ring and what it really is. And Frodo has offered it to Gandalf, but Gandalf has said, no, I can't take the ring. The ring is going to offer me power, power to do good, and I'm not going to be able to resist it. But if I take it, the ring is going to corrupt me. I can't take it even to keep it safe. And so Frodo responds with, as far as I understand what you have said, I suppose I must keep the ring and guard it, at least for the present, whatever it may do to me. But in the meanwhile it seems that I am a danger to all that live near me. I cannot keep the ring and stay here. I ought to leave Bag End, leave the Shire, leave everything and go away. He sighed. I should like to save the Shire, if I could. I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I shall know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet cannot stand there. Of course, I have sometimes thought of going away, but I imagined that as a kind of holiday. A series of adventures like Bilbo's are better, ending in peace. But this would mean exile, a flight from danger into danger, drawing it after me. Frodo knows that keeping the ring is going to be dangerous, and that to protect those around him he needs to leave the Shire, and that his journey is going to be dangerous, that it's going to be hard, that the ring is going to be working on him to negatively affect him. But he says, I'm going to keep the ring and guard it, whatever it may do to me. That as long as the Shire is safe, it doesn't matter what I'm going to go through. I'll still find peace and comfort knowing that even though I am in danger, even though I am in an unpleasant situation, that through my sacrifice, the Shire is being kept safe. And Frodo does sacrifice a lot. He sacrifices both his physical and mental health to destroy the ring. And this is something that I love in a sad way about Tolkien's writings. Tolkien doesn't believe that just because the quest is ended that then everybody gets to go home and be happy and return to a normal life. He understands that those difficulties that Frodo faced don't just go away because the ring has been destroyed. That as much as we want to go back to a normal life, our experiences change us and continue to affect us in the future. Frodo gets back to the Shire, but he's still having mental and physical anguish from his journey. What's the matter, Mr. Frodo? Said Sam. I am wounded, he answered. Wounded. It will never really heal. But then he got up, and the turn seemed to pass, and he was quite himself the next day. It was not until afterwards that Sam recalled that the date was October the 6th. 2 years before, on that day, it was dark on Weathertop. Time went on, and the year 1421 came in. Frodo was ill again in March, but with a great effort he concealed it. The Shire isn't the same to Frodo whenever he gets back, because he's not the same. The ring messed with his head, messed with his emotions. It hurt him. It harmed him. And throughout his journey, he was hurt physically as well. At Weathertop, he was stabbed by the Witch King of Angmar. That wound is still hurting him. At Mount Doom, Gollum bit off one of his fingers. Frodo has gone through physical, mental, and emotional turmoil. And he did it to save the Shire, to save the land that he loved. But he has sacrificed his own peace to do so. And so whenever he is offered the chance to travel into the West, to travel to the land of the elves with Gandalf and Bilbo and the elven leaders, Frodo decides to go to a place where he might find peace and healing from his wounds. And he says goodbye to his friends, to Sam, to Merry, to Pippin. And Sam starts to get emotional. "But," said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, "I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too, for years and years, after all you have done." "So I thought too, once. But I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved. But not for me. It must often be so, Sam. When things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them." Reading this passage, it's very hard for me not to associate this with Tolkien's time as a soldier. J.R.R. Tolkien fought in World War I. He lost many of his close personal friends in the war. He ended up in the hospital from getting sick from being in the trenches of World War I. And so it's really hard for me to read someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them, without remembering Tolkien's time in the trenches. And it's sad. It's sad that our past affects us, that the bad things, the traumas that we experience continue to affect us. But even so, even though Frodo gave up his own mental well-being, his own peace of mind, he saved the Shire and the whole world. And he wouldn't go back and change that. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" We are, all of us, going to face difficulties in life. We are fallen creatures living in a sinful world. And just because we choose to follow Christ does not mean that our difficulties are going to end. In fact, if anything, Jesus says the opposite. He says that if we follow him, we have to deny ourselves. We have to deny our own wants, our own desires, our own plans. That we have to take up our cross, an instrument of torture and death, and follow him. I hate the prosperity gospel, the idea that some people espouse that if you're following God, you're going to be granted earthly riches, that you're going to be blessed with earthly wealth and things like that. No, Christ says that we have to deny ourselves if we want to follow him, that we have to sacrifice our own desires and our own plans. Not all of us are going to sacrifice to the level of Frodo. We're not going to go on a quest to destroy a ring and be harmed physically and mentally as a result. But we are called to sacrifice on some level. And I think that this is a hard topic. Like I've said, I think that mental health is important, and that good mental health helps with your relationship with God and your relationship with others. And I also think that it's a difficult topic because I don't know how much we as Christians in America sacrifice. Like, we have comfortable lives for the most part. Like, I don't know if anything that I've personally gone through can even begin to compare to what Christ or Paul or Stephen uh, went through. Like, maybe I've faced a little bit of judgment for being a Christian, but does that compare to the stoning of Stephen? And so I can't answer the question of how each of us needs to sacrifice, or what exactly we need to do to sacrifice for Christ. But I know that we are supposed to deny ourselves, that we are supposed to take up our cross and follow Christ, even when it's hard, even when it goes against what we want. I can't help think of a woman from our church who is going to go to Ireland for missions. And I'm purposefully not saying her name because I don't want to put something out on the internet that says her name without her permission. So I'm being vague. I do know your name if you ever happen to listen to this. But I imagine that it's going to be hard moving from America to Ireland, that it's going to require her to give up a lot of her comforts, a lot of her close proximity to friends and family. But she's going out, she's sacrificing her time and her effort to show people the love of Christ. And that's the thing. We might not all have to literally lay down our lives, but sometimes we are going to have to sacrifice our time, our energy, our money to show God's love to the world. But here's the thing. If we follow Christ, He will give us the strength to bear the cross. He will give us the wisdom to deny ourselves and our own stupid desires. And even though we are denying ourselves, what Christ offers is so much better than anything that we can have by following our own wants. I took you from the ends of the earth, from its furthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you and have not rejected you. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. We may have to take up our cross and follow Christ, but we're not carrying the cross alone. God is with us. He is giving us the strength to deny ourselves and take up the cross and follow Him. Yes, He calls us to sacrifice, to give up our own desires, our time, our effort, our money, whatever. But He is there with us, and He is guiding us to a better future than we could ever get by following our own desires. We are called to go out into the world, to bring others to Christ, to show the love of Christ to the whole world. Sometimes that will involve sacrifice. And the exact way that each of us sacrifice will be different. We are called to different paths, to different positions within the church. But sometimes we have to give up the things that we want and instead focus on the things of God. And so I want to end by just looking at one final point in Tolkien's writings. In one of his letters, Tolkien describes Sauron in the following way. Sauron lingers in Middle-earth. Very slowly he becomes a reincarnation of evil and a thing lusting for complete power. Then, in the Fellowship of the Ring, whenever Gandalf is describing Sauron, he says the following: "For Sauron weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice, but the only measure that he knows is desire, desire for power, and so he judges all hearts. Into his heart the thought will not enter that any will refuse it, that having the ring we may seek to destroy it. If we seek this, we shall put him out of reckoning." By the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, any fair motives that Sauron had are completely gone. He just wants complete power, ultimate control. He has been consumed by evil. And it's a common theme in Tolkien's writings that evil cannot understand, it cannot comprehend selflessness, it cannot comprehend goodness. And that because it cannot comprehend these things, it constantly leaves selflessness out of its plans. It doesn't anticipate it. Sauron wanted ultimate power, and he knew that the ring offered power to whoever had it. And so in Sauron's mind, he cannot imagine somebody giving up power, the thing that he craves more than anything else. He cannot even fathom the idea that somebody would deny the ring. Sauron is unable to sacrifice his desire for power. And so he cannot even begin to comprehend the idea that somebody would be willing to sacrifice the thing that he wants most. The idea that they would send the ring to Mount Doom to be destroyed is a possibility he has not even considered. He thinks that everybody is going to be like him, unable to resist the ring. In fact, it is largely his fear that somebody else is going to claim the ring and try to use it against him that causes Sauron to lose the war. He should have brought his armies and surrounded Mount Doom, protected it at all costs, and sent out his Nazgul to hunt down Frodo and get the ring. If he'd done that, then maybe he would have won. But he was afraid that somebody else would claim the ring, and he anticipated that nobody would ever in their right mind give up the ring. And so whenever Aragorn and the armies of Rohan and Gondor march on the Black Gate, Sauron thinks that they must have the ring, because he can't imagine them marching to fight him with such a pitiful force unless they have the ring. And he has not considered the idea that they might try to destroy the ring rather than use it against him. So he sends his armies out to face Aragorn, to take the ring from Aragorn. But of course, Aragorn doesn't have the ring. Frodo has gone to Mount Doom to sacrifice the Ring of Power, to sacrifice what Sauron wants most. And until the very end, Sauron had not considered that possibility, because he can't comprehend selflessness. He can't understand somebody acting not for their own benefit, but sacrificing themselves and their own desires for the greater good. And so next week, we're going to talk about something else, another quality that evil in Tolkien's writings has trouble comprehending and has trouble planning for. I hope that this talk of sacrifice wasn't too depressing. But remember that even though we are called to sacrifice for God and for the world around us, God will give us the strength to give up our own desires and our own plans, and He will lead us to a greater good than anything that we could ever accomplish on our own. Thank you for listening.